Skybox. And this session is dedicated to talking about Skybox and vulnerability scanners, what the difference is between us and vulnerability scanners, and how we integrate with vulnerability scanners. So this session should last about half an hour. We've got some time for Q&A at the end. So before we get stuck into all the Skybox side of things, it's worth starting off with defining what we're going to talk about. So when we talk about scanning and vulnerability scanners, there's a few different definitions that are worth tying down. So there's things like port scanners, which you'll no doubt be familiar with. These are tools that will trawl IP ranges for ports. And if the port is open, this could point towards a vulnerability, but it won't necessarily tell you if there's a vulnerability on that machine. But this is one method that people do use. Now, vulnerability scanners themselves can also trawl IP space, but typically they authenticate against the machine. So now that they've logged into the machine, they can start to perform much more deep vulnerability analysis on that machine, understand what packages are running, what services are running, as well as what ports may be open as well. We have other scanners that are outside of what Skybox would do, things like web application scanners, looking at actually how a website is created and determine if there are security holes on that website. Now, these are all geared purely towards HTTP, web-based applications, and that's outside of what Skybox would typically pick up, because it's not looking at the specific application, we're just looking at the vulnerabilities and the software that's running on a machine. And the last one is antivirus, and you could argue there's some overlap between antivirus and vulnerability scanners. The big difference really is antivirus is real time. So it requires an agent to be installed on the machine. It's continuously updating and getting updates and patches every day and capturing that information in real time, whereas vulnerability scanners are typically run on a scheduled basis. For the purpose of the session that we're doing today, though, obviously we're talking about vulnerability scanners. So whilst all these other pieces of technology are interesting and important to fill out the security portfolio of a customer to give them complete protection, really what we're focusing on is a topic of vulnerability scanning technology. So if we look at vulnerability scanning technology and where it's come from and the history and pedigree, if you like, of scanning, we can kind of go back to when Nmap was released. So this is the first port scanner, really, that started a trend of other scanners that came out and used some of the underlying technology of Nmap and improved it and enhanced it to bring out their own products. Now, before Nmap was released, throughout the 90s and even in the 80s, antivirus and anti-malware software became very popular with companies like McAfee and so on. So kind of before 1997, really, the idea of finding vulnerabilities and viruses and malware on machines was already very popular. There was many companies that were around for a long time before Nmap that were making money off of selling antivirus and anti-malware and agent-based software. But Nmap was really the first. It was the beginning of agentless network, if you like, based scanning. Not long after Nessus was released, so the Nessus project was founded as a free project. The very first version was based off Nmap, but it doesn't use that anymore. It uses its own proprietary scanner. But Nmap was really the foundation that sprung out Nessus, really, and the idea, I would say. But the Nessus project started around 1998. And then Qualys was founded not very long after that. So Qualys being a cloud-based scanning solution. Rapid7 founded not long after that. And these are all kind of the biggest players and the biggest names that you would hear in the industry around vulnerability scanning. Another company called Encircle came out and released a product called IP360. The open source scanning project called OpenVAS was started in 2009 and is still ongoing today. And then Tripwire acquired this Encircle product, the IP360. That was acquired by Tripwire in 2013. So I would say in terms of what what we see in the field and with customers, Nessus, Qualys, Rapid7, Tripwire, those 4 vendors will make up the lion's share of enterprise vulnerability scanning software. Open VAS you may see here and there. But really those 4, I would say, take up the lion's share of what we would classify as the enterprise scanning market. There's a whole load of others. There's a lot of others that are out there. But these are certainly the tier 1. So the scanning technology, the scanning vendors all kind of became popular in the late 90s and certainly into the early noughties. And the reason that companies bought into these scanning technologies, why is it useful to scan your network? Well, the first thing is that these scanners will allow you to actually properly discover assets, operating systems, applications that are running on those assets, automatically. So that was in that time, that was a gap in network security, and being able to discover the assets was very important at that point in time. Once you log into the asset, maybe authenticate against it, you can then find out which vulnerabilities are on that machine. The vulnerabilities that the hackers are using, basically. Hackers also use vulnerability scanning technology in their reconnaissance efforts, and they actually use some of these technologies against people, as well as them being used for discovering and remediating vulnerabilities before they become a problem. So we certainly want to find out the vulnerabilities that the hackers are using, be able to measure the count of vulnerabilities you've got, and then the severity level. So the severity level would come from that vulnerabilities CVSS score, so the public vulnerability score. It's usually between 0 and 10 to say how severe that is. So once you understand the count and the number of severity, then you can start to potentially prioritize and work out which assets that you want to touch first and remediate first. Then you can also work out, using these tools, if patches have been applied. So when the next scan runs, then we'll pick up, well, this machine has had Windows patches and Windows software installed that now mitigates these vulnerabilities, for example. So now you can understand not just what problems you've got, but what you've fixed as well. And this allows customers to report back to the business what the problems are, and to give a risk approach, if you like, to implementing security and fixing vulnerabilities. And you know what? There's wide industry agreement that you need a scanner. You need some kind of input to understand where the holes are. There's also compliance that kind of comes into this. So compliance necessitates many times that you have some kind of scanning technology. So having a scanner is actually, in some cases, a mandatory requirement. You actually need one to stay compliant. So there's definitely a lot of good reasons why people buy scanners and why they became very popular, and why they're still needed today. But scanners don't do everything, right? There's some limitations to scanning technology. Generally, the biggest issue that I've come across when talking to customers about whatever scanning technology they pick, whether it's Qualys or Nessus or whatever, is that it's disruptive. These scans require you to authenticate against the machine. The machine then needs to scan itself and find vulnerabilities, and then report that all back to some central system. That all requires CPU cycles on the machine. That all requires bandwidth over the network. So customers find these technologies somewhat disruptive to day-to-day operations. And the reports that they get back from these scanners find a lot of problems, which is, on one side, it's a good thing that they're finding all these issues. The other side of the challenge is that it's overwhelming. Right? There's an overwhelming number of vulnerabilities that get reported, and customers don't feel like they move forward with their remediation efforts. Because they're disruptive, they usually can't be run very often, leaving a customer with a vulnerability gap, if you like. And I'm talking, most customers are don't believe there's many customers that will be able to run these daily, certainly. Weekly, I think, is a stretch. Most customers that I speak to would be monthly, or maybe every 2 weeks is again, a stretch. When you talk about running a scan against hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of machines, it isn't a small thing. You know, it's quite a big challenge. So to run these daily is usually impossible. Which means that within that time frame, you know, between those monthly scans, they've got this gap, this vulnerability gap they need to address. The scanners don't tend to care about the network. Scanners don't, whilst they can understand that this is a firewall and the vulnerabilities that are on this firewall, they don't understand that the firewall is sitting in front of PCI compliant devices. They don't really understand the context of how the network is structured, and also the assets themselves and if they're business assets. So again, the scanner may not know that, okay, these assets are part of GDPR, and actually vulnerabilities on these assets should be fixed quickly because, you know, they are integral to our business. You know, they're part of an audit, they're part of compliance. So fixing vulnerabilities on those assets is probably more important than you know, a different machine like a print server or something like that. And like any of these technologies, you know, there's none of the one vendors you can single out. They all suffer from false positives, like any of these kinds of technologies, where you're relying on understanding signatures and interpreting information, banner information. You do get false positives in any of these technologies. So it's usually good to have more than one lens, if you like, more than one view on the output of these reports and these scans. So Skybox has a solution that can integrate and understand these scanners. We have vulnerability control. So vulnerability control from Skybox will take scan data, import scan data into the model, and overlay it onto the network and add business and attack contexts to that information. You know, we can also do our own vulnerability detection. So we can do what you'd like to call a vulnerability scan, but passively, without authenticating with the machines, without an agent. And we can do this by looking at the asset database. So if the customer already has an asset or patch repository that we can use, then we can take that data source and run our own vulnerability detection capability on there. And we do that using our dictionary, which is updated every day. So we have a built-in dictionary, vulnerability dictionary. And this allows us to run these scans, this vulnerability detection every day. So this helps to bridge that gap that customers will typically have if they have a traditional scanner from Qualys or Nessus, which runs every month. Here, Skybox can run our vulnerability detection every day because it's not disruptive and it won't slow down machines and it's not going to cause a lot of traffic on the network. So this helps to bridge that gap and the shortcoming of the existing scanners. We can also better prioritize remediation efforts. Because Skybox has the context of the network, you know, we do network modeling, that's kind of the primary thing that Skybox does, the technology does. Because we've got that model and the understanding of the infrastructure, we can then help to prioritize those remediation efforts much more intelligently by giving that additional context. And yeah, and nice to have as well on top of everything else we do is the penetration testing. So because we've already built this model of the infrastructure, we understand the firewalls, the routers, how they're all connected. Once we understand the vulnerabilities that live inside of that network, you know, the attack surface, we can then model a penetration, a 2- or 3-step attack from an attacker to say, hey, well, if they do get control of this machine in the DMZ, for example, where else could they traverse the network to? What other access would they then get, which they may not have had before, you know, coming in from the internet? So, you know, we can actually perform those penetration tests automatically as well. So just to explain how we do our vulnerability detection. So if we don't have any agents, we don't authenticate with machines, we don't scan any networks, how does Skybox understand what vulnerabilities live on a machine? So we can do this through an asset database. So if a customer buys vulnerability control, they'll have our dictionary, right? So they have our vulnerability dictionary. And if they have some kind of asset database that already exists, so if they use, for example, Microsoft SCCM, or if they use Red Hat Satellite, or a number of other asset management tools, and this is an output from SCCM. So here you can see this is a machine called Winnie, is its unique tag, Winnie. It's a Microsoft Windows Server 2003 machine. You can see its IP address, 192.168.82.21. But the important stuff is in the middle, in the bottom in the middle, where you've got edit plus version 2. We understand the actual version of software that's running on there, and we've got the same for all of the software. So we can take that software, that banner information from the software, out of SCCM or the Asset Management Database. We understand that it's a Windows server. We understand what patches are running on it. We understand what software is running on it. We can then take that information, marry it up with our vulnerability dictionary to tell you if you've got a vulnerability on that machine. So without having to scan anything, without having to install agents, without having to disrupt the network, we can do something with an asset database every day and run scans on that asset database every day to infer and find vulnerabilities that you may miss in that vulnerability gap when you're running your monthly scans with the traditional enterprise scanning solutions. So as well as running our own vulnerability detection and Skybox finding vulnerabilities, like I said earlier, we can import a report as well from a third-party scanner. So these third-party tools, they will generate reports, different ways of remediating and prioritizing and fixing vulnerabilities. One quite common way is to give you a list of machines. So we will tell you, this is from Security Center from Tenable, a list of hosts that you need to go off and fix first. So here we have a host, it has the most vulnerabilities, so that is the machine that you need to fix first. But that report that you get from that scanner doesn't know where that machine is in the context of the network. It doesn't understand the networking that machine sits behind. That machine could sit behind 5 or 6 firewalls and be completely closed off from the open world, and actually isn't really an attacker's first port of call. So the context of the location of that is important and missing. The other thing is that we don't know if this asset is actually important to the business operating. Is this part of compliance? Has this got cardholder data information on it? Does this have other important information that I want to make sure we fix this asset first based on the business requirement? But again, you don't usually get this context from a scan report. And the other thing is, well, this host here, okay, has got, 200 vulnerabilities on this host. Well, out of those 200, which one should I fix first? How do I go through that list of vulnerabilities on that host? Because 200 is a lot to fix. Some of them I might not be able to fix because it may require me restarting that host, which may be in production. I don't know. So again, we're lacking that context about going beyond like a vulnerability count on host to remediate is you need extra pieces of information to fill in that gap. So certainly this is an area that Skybox can help with. So we have what we call threat-centric vulnerability management, where we're not just taking the vulnerabilities and information about those, but we're adding the context of the infrastructure, the network, the context of the business, and is this asset important to my business, and understanding if those exploits that we're worrying about are actually being used in the wild. So we understand, as the diagram kind of dictates, we understand if there's firewalls sitting in front of that asset, if it's even routable, if there's an IPS with IPS signatures that may combat that vulnerability. And we understand if that vulnerability is living on an important asset. So, without that extra context of the exposure, the criticality, the business context, the network context, remediation efforts are kind of wasted. And what Skybox does is it will take that context of the network, the vulnerability, the business asset, where it is, if it's being exploited in the wild, we'll perform analytics on that and then give you a prioritization list with imminent stuff that you need to fix right now at the top of this cone, and that's stuff that we know is easily exploitable, easy to exploit vulnerabilities, directly exposed vulnerabilities, and stuff that's being exploited in the wild. Those are the things that you need to fix right now. And then everything else, whether it's either a vulnerability that's exploitable, but it might be sitting behind a firewall, so no one can touch it right now, or it's a vulnerability that has no known exploit. Right? So we don't even know if anyone can leverage the vulnerability. It's not something that we've seen in the real world. So those are things that you would prioritize for a later date. So if you think about a previous example, and the other way of prioritizing is, hey, let's do it by host. Well, let's take the hosts that have got the most critical, or the highest vulnerability count even, and let's fix those first, right? So we had a host with 200 vulnerabilities, and I asked, well, which ones do you fix first? Now, most customers will use this metric, which is CVSS scoring, severity. They'll say, well, look at all those critical vulnerabilities we've got on that host. So let's fix the critical vulnerabilities first. And that is generally the only metric most customers have with a traditional scanner. So whether they use Nessus or Qualys or whatever, the only real metric they have in terms of which vulnerabilities to fix first is really severity. They don't have the context of the network and the context of the business assets, or if they're being exploited in the wild, they're using criticality. So, and that has a lot of flaws in it. Again, that doesn't tell you if this vulnerability is sitting behind a firewall and no one can actually access it. The criticality doesn't tell you anything about that. Again, the criticality doesn't care about the asset itself and if it's important to your business. And actually, there's no information about it actually being exploited in the wild either. So criticality on its own is a somewhat useless metric to map risk back to that vulnerability, to work out if fixing that vulnerability is going to have a big impact on the risk associated to my business. You need to have other factors like the network context, like the business asset context, to really make an intelligent decision about which ones you're remediating first. And to just hit that point home, I think the most powerful story that I educate my customers on is the fact that the people who write software for malware kits, for exploit kits, for rootkits and things like that, they don't write that software with critical vulnerabilities at the core of it. And the reason is that most of those people are very intelligent human beings. They're very clever people. A lot of them are from the industry, right? A lot of them are ex-industry associates of ours who have gone to the dark side. But they understand this problem. They understand that the customers who have vulnerability scanners will go around and fix critical vulnerabilities first, because that is the only metric they are using. However, the people who write the software and the malware and the ransomware kits, they don't use critical vulnerabilities. They go for high and medium vulnerabilities, especially medium vulnerabilities, because they know that you're never going to fix a medium level vulnerability. And this is from external reports. There's multiple reports that say the same thing, from X-Force, from IBM, from Gartner. And they all say the same thing, is that attackers, when they exploit a vulnerability to get control of a machine, they generally go for medium and high vulnerabilities, because they know, being from the industry, that you'll never get around to fixing them. And there's a much higher chance that they will be successful in their attack if they use a vulnerability that flies under your radar because you're not fixing it, but gives them enough control over the machine to do what they want, to inject code or to get root level access on the machine. So fixing critical vulnerabilities and using the CVSS score as your metric is the wrong way of doing it. And the attackers know that, and they are abusing that as well. So you need to find a way of fixing vulnerabilities that isn't based on the CVSS score. You need other metrics in there to give you more intelligence around which ones you're fixing first and why. So you can catch the high and the medium vulnerabilities based on the context of the infrastructure and the business assets as well. And this is exactly what Skybox does, right? This is our bread and butter. We move customers away from taking a scan from one of the many scanners out there, looking at a vulnerability, and then just using the severity of that vulnerability to calculate the risk to the business. That is not an intelligent way of working out, should I fix this vulnerability first, because it's the most risky to us. It's got the biggest impact to our business. The CVSS score, the severity of the vulnerability, is just not enough information. So Skybox, has always had an idea of business impact and exposure, because we understand the context of the network. We can assign assets to business asset groups, and we can say, if they're part of PCI compliance, for example, or if they've got medical records on them, or how much it's going to cost our business if these assets go down. You can define that in Skybox. We understand the exposure because we understand the network, and we can understand the context of firewalls and IPS devices and routers and so on in the flow of traffic. The severity we obviously get from the vulnerability itself in the CVSS score. And then we have our own research team who understand, and as part of our dictionary, we can report on which vulnerabilities are actually being exploited in the wild. So again, those vulnerabilities that sit on assets that maybe they aren't directly exposed, no one can get to them, but if that machine ever was exposed, you can be pretty sure that it will be exploited pretty quickly, because we understand that there's campaigns and bots on the internet that are running 24/7 trying to find machines that they can exploit with these old vulnerabilities or these well understood vulnerabilities. So this is what Skybox really does, is adding more context to that scan that a customer probably already has, but they've traditionally only ever used severity to understand what the risk is to the business, and that's the metric they use to remediate. Whereas there's many more metrics at play here that they need to consider. So just in summary, just to say, vulnerability scanners are a very important part of any customer security strategy. This session wasn't about how we're better than scanners. Customers still absolutely need some way of discovering vulnerabilities on their network, and scanners are a very good way of doing it. But they have some limitations. The biggest limitations they have is that they can't be run every day, and they don't have the additional context of the infrastructure to help prioritize remediation. And this is what Skybox brings to the conversation. We can do our scanless vulnerability detection every day. We can help to bridge that vulnerability gap that customers have. The ones that scan every month or every, whenever they have to, basically, every few months, they've got this huge gap in their scanning that they need to fix. We can add the network and business context to that scan data. So again, we're not replacing anything. We're not taking out the scanner. We're enhancing really what the scanner does, and we're adding more context to it. And we can tell you if those vulnerabilities are being exploited in the wild. And ultimately, really, is the kind of crown jewel in all of this is the prioritization of those remediation efforts. And that's really what Skybox is bringing to the table, above and beyond everything else, is the context of the business and the network to help prioritize remediation in a much, much, much more intelligent way. Bringing customers down from generating reports of 100,000 vulnerabilities every month, going off and fixing a bunch of vulnerabilities, but by the time the next report is run, they're back at 100,000 vulnerabilities and they haven't actually moved forward. We can take that 100,000 vulnerabilities and we can give them a much more focused list of, hundreds or thousands of vulnerabilities just to manage and plow through. That is actually going to be, reducible on a monthly basis, much more realistic and much more manageable. So this is an integration and an enhancement to scanning technology, and certainly not what we would position as a rip and replace to it.